Hey YouTube, welcome to my kitchen. I'm in here baking bread today, and I thought since we're here, we might as well talk about keeping a dry sourdough starter. I've been getting lots of questions about this, and for good reason. The stores are out of yeast, a lot of the stores are out of bread, and so people are looking for alternatives for baking bread in their own home. Well, sourdough is the perfect thing for that because you can capture the yeasts in the air and the yeasts that are on the grains in your flour to actually make your bread rise. I know there's science behind this, but I like to think of it as magic. And every time I bake bread, which is almost every day, it still feels like that years in. Now, a traditional sourdough starter is made with equal parts water and flour, and you have to feed it a couple times a day, and there's always excess that you're trying to get rid of. It can be really high maintenance. So I want to introduce you to a new idea of sourdough starter, which is a dry sourdough starter. I don't mean completely dry, I mean a lot drier than your traditional sourdough starter. And it all fits in this little tub just like this. Every time you want to bake bread, you just take a small pinch of it, mix it with water and flour, and let it sit for a few hours. This is way easier. It adds a lot more consistency to your bread baking. It doesn't get skunky. It doesn't eat a lot of flour. This is a really good way to keep a sourdough starter if you're just getting started, or if you're looking for maybe an alternative to your, big old sourdough starter that's sitting on your kitchen counter. So let me show you how to make a starter. Then I'll show you how to feed that starter every time you want to bake bread. Assuming you don't have any friends around you who will give you a chunk of their starter, assuming you have to start from ground zero, let's begin there. We're going to do this by adding 45 grams of water into a bowl. I always use a digital scale with my bread baking because the consistency is so important until you get a really, really good feel for it. To that 45 grams of water, I'm going to add 60 grams of flour. I use an Einkorn all-purpose flour because I love the taste of it. The flavor is super buttery. It's also got a really weak gluten, so it's really easy for your body to digest. That plus sourdough makes this the bread that most people can eat even if they have gluten intolerance. Did I mention it tastes good? It tastes really good. So we've got our 45 grams of water. Go ahead and add in your 60 grams of flour. If you don't have all-purpose Einkorn flour, you can just use whatever all-purpose flour you can find at the store. Although I will say, once you get acclimated to Einkorn flour, it's really hard to go back because it's so flavorful. All right, how easy was that? Now at this point, you need to pick up your starter in your hands and you need to introduce yourself because this is about to be your new best friend in the kitchen. If my house was on fire, I would grab my children and then I would grab my sourdough starter. It's very special to me. It's going to be a little messy, especially if you're using Einkorn. It's a little sticky. But just give it a little toss, say hello, put it back into a bowl, and cover it tightly with plastic wrap. Let it sit at room temperature for 48 hours, okay? Day 1, let it sit for 2 days. Now let's talk about day 3. On day 3, we're going to take all that starter that's been sitting out for 2 days, and we're going to add 30 grams of water and 60 grams more of flour. Then we're going to cover it again and set it aside until day 4. On day 4, we're going to take all that starter that's accumulated so far. We're going to add 30 grams more water and 60 grams more flour. Then we're going to cover it again and set it aside until day 5. By now, you'll probably notice some action going on in your starter. Maybe you'll notice a nice smell or a few bubbles. Day 5 is the first day that we're going to refresh our starter. And this is really what's going to separate our dry sourdough starter from a traditional wet sourdough starter. So by day 5, you're going to have a lot more than this in your bowl, but you're just going to take out 10 grams. Now, to that 10 grams, you're going to add in 30 grams of water and 60 grams of flour once again. After you've mixed that all together, Put it into a Tupperware like this, or maybe a glass mason jar with a lid, and set it aside. After you've refreshed your starter and put it into your glass covered container, you should notice that at about 6 to 10 hours of sitting at room temperature, it has started to bring bubbles. It should smell really good, like a really good bread. If you don't have that quite yet, then on day 6, repeat that refreshing by taking 10 grams, adding in your 30 grams of water and your 60 grams of flour and doing it again. And keep doing that until within about 6 to 10 hours, you get that bubble kind of coming up in your sourdough starter. Let me show you what that looks like. I have my starter here. I got a piece of this from Jovial's founder, Carla, when we were in Italy last year. Can you see the bubbles in that? So you'll notice that it's a pretty tacky dough. It's pretty stiff. It's not at all like a wet sourdough starter. And this is how it remains. I keep this in my fridge all the time. And every time I want to bake bread, I just grab a chunk and refresh it. Let me show you how I do that. If you want to get really good at bread baking, especially sourdough bread baking, get a digital scale. Get a digital scale. It makes such a difference because you can just get so precise. You can snag them for $15 on Amazon. So just invest, okay? Invest in your bread baking. Okay, every time I want to bake bread or anything that requires a sourdough starter, I have to think just a few hours ahead. I go get my bubbly, refreshed sourdough starter, and I take out 30 grams, which is about a tablespoon. Ooh, 29, pretty good. I've gotten pretty good at guessing it over the years. Okay, now I've taken my 30 grams out of my sourdough starter. All I do now is cover it back up and stick it back in the fridge. The only thing you have to be aware of with a dry sourdough starter, just like with any sourdough starter, is that I always need to have at least 10 grams left in here so that I can refresh it with that 30 grams of water and 60 grams of flour, and so that it can continue on. So never use all your sourdough starter. Always make sure you have a little bit to feed, to leave out, get nice and bubbly, and then tuck in your fridge for when you want to bake bread. So let's say now I've got my starter and it smells good and it's bubbling, and now I want to bake bread. I've got my 30 grams of starter here in my bowl. To that, I'm going to add 130 grams of water. Combine the two. You'll notice when you take your starter out of the fridge, it's just a little cold. So you can add it, mix it with warm water, let it dissolve just for a second. Now we're gonna add in 120 grams of flour. So this is what I do every single time I wanna bake bread, or I want to bake something with sourdough starter. Maybe I want to make sourdough cinnamon rolls or pizza crusts or something like that. This is how it all begins. 30 grams of starter, 130 grams of water, 120 grams of flour. Woo! Okay, look how much different this looks than our starter. It has a lot more water, and that's good. Give it a good mixing. Okay, all that you have to do now is cover this with plastic wrap and set it aside somewhere at room temperature. And you'll notice that within just 2 or 3 hours, it gets really bubbly and it starts to smell really good. And at that point, you can use it just like you would a traditional sourdough starter. You can measure out a cup of it to make bread if that's the recipe that you're using. I'm gonna make sure that I put my very favorite everyday bread recipe right underneath the video, so be sure to check that out. I hope that by keeping a sourdough starter in this way, a lot more of you will be encouraged to keep a sourdough starter. I kept a bad one for about 10 years and it just got so high maintenance, I tossed it. I just couldn't keep up with it anymore. This is much, much easier, so I hope that you find the method helpful. Also, for those of you who are interested, we are sending out a piece of our personal, this baby right here, our personal sourdough starter to all new cooking community members this month only. So be sure to check out the details of that right below the video. If you have questions about keeping a dry sourdough starter, be sure to ask them in the comments below and I'll circle back around to give you some answers. For more resources on einkorn flour, be sure to check out jovialfoods.com. Carla has some great videos on there about baking with sourdough and seeing better results from your homemade bread. I wish all of you well during this time, and you know, as hard as it can be, fresh baked bread does help.